and welcome to Doing Disasters Differently, the podcast with Renae Hanvin, which is all about inspiring you to start thinking and doing disasters a little bit differently too. In this episode, I'm talking with Craig Fugate. Craig is a Chief Emergency Management Officer at One Concern and a former FEMA Administrator from 2009 to 2017. And we're talking about the Waffle House Index. Now, a little bit about Craig. W. Craig Fugate served as President Barack Obama's FEMA Administrator from May 2009 until January 2017. And from those of you who are not aware, FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency in America. Previously, he served as Florida Governor Jeb Bush's Emergency Management Director from 2001 to 2007 and Governor Charlie Crist from 2007 to 2009. Craig led FEMA through multiple record-breaking disaster years and oversaw the federal government's response to major events such as the Joplin and Moore tornadoes, Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Matthew, and the 2016 Louisiana flooding. Craig set a clear and compelling vision, mission, and priorities for FEMA and relentlessly drove the agency to achieve better outcomes for survivors. FEMA's effectiveness in dealing with more than 500 presidentially declared major disasters and emergencies under Craig's leadership restored the faith of the American people in the federal government's ability to respond to disasters. Craig set a clear and compelling vision, mission, and priorities for FEMA and relentlessly drove the agency to achieve better outcomes for survivors. FEMA's effectiveness in dealing with more than 500 presidentially declared major disasters and emergencies under Craig's leadership restored the faith of the American people in the federal government's ability to respond to disasters. Prior to his tenure at FEMA, Craig was widely praised for his management under Governor Jeb Bush of the devastating effects of the 2004 and 2005 Florida hurricane seasons, including Charlie, Francis, Ivan, Jean, Dennis, Katrina, and Wilma. Craig currently provides senior level advice and consultation in the area of disaster management and resiliency policy through Craig Fugate Consulting LLC. Craig also serves as the Chief Emergency Management Officer at One Concern. Now, I like to start with where we met. So I have to confess, I've been following Craig for many, many, many years, way back when I worked at Australia Post. And in fact, it's the Waffle House Index and hearing about the Waffle House Index that was a major catalyst for me recognizing the greater role the private sector can play and the important role that we need the private sector to play in building national resilience alongside government. I reached out to Craig through LinkedIn and I'm grateful to have this conversation with him today. So Craig, welcome. Great to talk with you today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I've got so many questions I want to ask you, but I'm going to limit to a few. So can you explain to me what the Waffle House Index is and how did you come up with it?
Well, to understand the Waffle House Index, you got to know what a Waffle House is. And it's a chain of restaurants, basically fast food diners, best known for their breakfast, waffles, and hash browns across much of the southeast of the United States. And the Waffle House as a diner, they're open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They don't close for holidays. And the index actually came about in 2004 when Florida was responding to 4 hurricanes that hit the state that year. And after the first hurricane hit, and it hit August 13th of Friday the 13th in 2004, was Hurricane Charlie, struck the Florida Peninsula in the southwest. I had gone down with other members of my team, and we were in the area the day after the storm, and we stayed down there for several weeks. The days were long. If you've been in a disaster, you know, meals are kind of like whatever you can get, and you're not sure you're going to get a meal. And the days were long. We were doing about 18-hour days. So we had found a place to stay just outside of the disaster area. But they had been impacted, a lot of power outage stuff. When we got up in the morning, we'd get up in the U.S. East Coast time about 4:30, 5 a.m. in the morning. We knew if we didn't get something to eat for breakfast, we weren't sure we were going to eat all day. So we would just get on the interstate system or highway system And the first day, we actually drive away from the disaster area. We were actually driving south. The storm impacts were north of us. And we finally saw the lights off of the interstate of a Waffle House. It was open. So we pulled in. We go in and get breakfast. But normally they have these very bright colored plastic laminated menus with all of the great food they serve. And instead we got this mimeograph sheet of limp paper. And the waitress said, "We're sorry, but the power went out. We lost everything in the freezer. The only thing that's available is what's on this printed menu." So we said, "Fine. You got coffee, you got eggs, you got hash browns. We're good." We had breakfast. Next morning, after a full day, we start this whole cycle again. But instead of having to drive further south, there was actually a Waffle House where we were getting on the interstate. So we went in there, same deal. Here's a mimeograph menu. They don't have a full menu, but they had gotten the store reopened. And the thing was, if you looked around, they were the only thing open. And what we kept seeing was if there was anything going to open, it was going to be a Waffle House, and they were going to open first. So that observation got put into practice because we were also looking at a lot of the state had been impacted by Charlie, and we had different degrees of damages. The area where it made landfall was catastrophic. It hit as a Category 4 hurricane. But if you're familiar with Florida, if you're familiar with Disney World, which sits in the middle state, Orlando, the Orlando International Airport had hundreds of millions of dollars of damage inland from the storm as it went across the state. So we were dealing with a lot of counties. And we were color coding their response status of red, yellow, and green. Red, bad; yellow, kind of bad; green, they're okay, or they're going to do it themselves. And we were looking at things like, is their EOC open, fully operational? They're red. If the EOC is partially activated, they're closing at night. They're yellow. If their EOC is closed, they're green. Schools, things like that. And my team at that time put in a slide deck, a slide deck called the Waffle House Index. And the index was, if the Waffle House is open and has a full menu, it's green. If the Waffle House is open and has a limited menu, it's yellow. If the Waffle House is closed, it's red. And it would have probably stopped there, except for the fact we got hit by another hurricane. And we got hit by another hurricane. And we got hit by another hurricane. And what we had started doing in Florida differently in 2004, and it's part of the lessons we learned from Hurricane Andrew, was this idea that when disasters happen, we're going to go in and do an assessment, determine what is needed, and then we send the resources. We had put so much effort in getting the assessment teams in there quickly to do these assessments. It was still taking us 2 to 3 days to generate the response. And I thought we could get faster. So I said, what if we just eliminate the whole assessment process and respond like it's bad? We have enough hurricane history in Florida to have a pretty good idea. If you tell me the population and the storm, where it hit and how strong it was, I can at least generate the initial response. And so we began this process of not waiting till after the hurricane had passed and to send in assessment teams. As soon as the winds got down to where it was safe enough to get on the road, we'd start driving into the areas of impact. The challenge was, if you're driving into an area of impact, particularly with hurricanes, and you see this with cyclones down there, the area of impact can be very large, and you'll start seeing damages as you're moving into the area. And so the question was, well, when is it bad enough to stop and go to work? And that's where the Waffle House came in. Because of our interstate or highway system in the United States, across the South, there's a Waffle House, I won't say at every intersection, but almost at every intersection, to the point where they became almost like, road posts. As you're driving in, if the Waffle House is open, it has a full menu, it's not that bad, keep going. If you get there and the Waffle House has got a limited menu, we got power outages, we may have water issues. We may have a lot of mass care issues, but we're probably not in the area where we need the search and rescue teams. But if you drive and you get to the Waffle House that is no closed because of the storm, that's pretty bad, and that's an area where we should go to work. And so that rule of thumb became useful to us, and that's how the Waffle House kind of became almost like disaster lore within the emergency management community. But then people started finding out about it, Wall Street Journal and others. And as you started thinking about it, Waffle House is actually a pretty good indicator of the community's infrastructure in the aftermath of a disaster, because we know they're going to get open if they can. If the building is safe and they can get the grill going, they're going back to work even without power. And they have a lot of steps and things they do. They actually send folks down to their corporate office, but because they're so set on getting open, if they can get open, it tells you a lot about the community just by that status. So that was the genesis of the Waffle House Index. And it was never intended to grow to what it has, but it has served, at least in my career, Waffle Houses are, is a good tool just to tell me how a community is doing in the immediate aftermath of a disaster.
Well, I have to say, apart from the fact that I absolutely want the Waffle House to come here, because I can't think of anything better than driving along Australian roads and stopping off for some waffles. The Waffle House Index and just the concept of it has been a real fundamental part of me and creating corporate to community and driving in Australia more private sector contribution. So what a fantastic outcome to discover from the situations that you were in. Did the Waffle House know that you were making them famous and that you were basically positioning them in terms of, being this kind of index? Were they part of those conversations?
Not until I got to FEMA. So we were using the Waffle House Index starting back in 2004. And I never had permission. I never met with Waffle House. This was just observations of a restaurant. And they own most all of their restaurants. They have a few franchises, but as a chain of restaurants, they're kind of different is that they're privately held. They don't report to investors and they don't advertise. Their signs themselves are the advertising. So I didn't realize I was giving them some of the best publicity they've ever had with the index. And by the time I got to FEMA, and that was in 2009, we got a call that Waffle House wanted to come meet with us. And I thought I was in trouble. I thought they were mad that we were using trademarks or something without permission. And they actually came in and they were actually thrilled. And they started telling us their story because I said, well, you guys must have all these procedures and elaborate stuff. And they go, well, not really. Because they have so many restaurants in the South, they had been dealing with hurricanes most of that, their history. And they had actually kind of built an ad hoc system where their corporate leadership, their president, vice president, all these guys and women that work in their headquarters, they would literally take and they had to figure this out that they're going to need cash. So the chief financial officer goes down to the local bank and gets a lot of cash. They puts it in a lockbox. They go to their warehouses and they load up all the stuff that they know they're going to need to reopen a store: food, cleaning supplies, extra plastic silverware plates and stuff. They don't have water. And they literally load up their trucks and they drive to the disaster area and they go to their stores and start working to get them open. I mean, and it's kind of interesting how many CEOs is proud to say, I can't run the cash register, but I can work the mop, and I'll mop to get that store open.
Yeah.
And that whole philosophy of just and kind of their, I said, well, how do you guys do all this and stuff? They said, well, we operate under a very simple, operational philosophy: just get open. And they have all kinds of workarounds. They said, obviously our first concern is making sure our employees are safe, that we're providing safe food, that our customers are safe. We don't want to make anybody sick or endanger anybody. But they'll do everything from, if they got, a store that's standing, they'll get, and a lot of them are on portable gas. They'll get the grill going. And if they can get the grill going, they'll start cooking. If the water's not safe, they'll actually pour bottled water in the coffee makers and start making coffee, and they'll serve ice cold canned drinks, but you won't have ice. Things like that they have learned over time. They bring in the extra dumpsters. They'll bring in portalets if they need to, the portable bathrooms. They'll do a lot of this stuff to get that store open. And they do it within usually the first day or so of particularly hurricanes. As soon as they can get in there, they're reopening.
I just think it's so fantastic how, I guess, it's an organic growth, and it's an organization, a private sector organization that has decided the role that it wants to play before, during, and after disasters for its employees and for its customers and for the community in which it operates in and serves, and to then seed that into the culture and the strategic leadership and culture of that organization, it's so simple, but it's so smart, because you're building the trust and you're building the connections with your community in the good times for the bad, which is obviously going to help them in the good times as well. And yeah, I don't know many CEOs who would literally, you know, pack up and go and mop some floors. So I've heard a lot about how the Waffle House, literally, if all they can do is serve water, then they do it, because that's what the community needs and that's the role that they feel like they can play. And I've heard that it's also a great place for a lot of the emergency services workers going into, you know, the hurricane or disaster areas. So they have a place to go to as well. It's not just for the communities, but it's for the heroes that help the communities as well.
Yeah, they told me what I thought was a pretty amusing story. They were after one of the hurricanes going down to Galveston Island in Texas, and when they started heading that way, there were all these checkpoints, and they weren't letting anybody back on the island, and you had to be, you know, a credentialed responder to get in there. And every time they got to the checkpoint, there'd be like local law enforcement, there would be the military National Guard there. And every time they pulled in, of course, their trucks have logos of Waffle House on it. They would just wave them through. They weren't even stopping them. And they were kind of laughing that, you know, they got to the final checkpoint. This was the actual bridge that went into Galveston Island. They figured, okay, this is about as far as we're going to get. We're going to have to tarp our way past these guys. And they get there, and they were going, what took you so long? You know, we're eating MREs and drinking instant coffee made with purified, you know, with water with, you know, chemicals, and it tastes horrible. And even with Hurricane Laura, there was a tweet from the Weather Channel, which is in the U.S., you know, our big weather TV station, that cable that goes out to all these disasters. And they're down in Laura, and they're proud of the fact that the day after Laura, they're holding up cups of Waffle House coffee. And having been out on enough of these disasters, the thing that I've always marveled at is, for a lot of people, both the responders, but also the people who live in the area, being able to go in and sit down and just for that 30 minutes or so, eat food, have coffee, have a cold drink, is about the most normal thing that you may be doing in the most bizarre situation you find yourself in. And it's really interesting to hear people. That's when they start telling their stories, which I think is also a very important part of people managing and coping with stress, is storytelling and being able to think out and talk about what they went through with other people. And so these Waffle Houses, again, as you point out, and I asked them, I said, what's the business reason you get open? And they said, well, we don't make a lot of money doing this, but we figure we owe it to our employees. They call them their associates, and we owe it to our customers. And they kind of chuckle and said, you know, we got some customers, if we're not open, we're not sure they know where to go eat.
Yeah, and I think I love the work that Daniel Aldrich does. So he's from Boston in America, and he's a global expert in social capital. And he says a lot about the fact that, you know, people build resilience, and people are the foundations of resilience. And, you know, in fact, connections with people is more important than batteries or water in many instances. And you know, if the Waffle House just identified the fact that if they can just bring people together and give people that place to connect and to, you know, just take a breath and leave the immediate, you know, situation that they're in. I mean, you know, that you can't build more trust or, you know, brand equity than, you know, being there in those sorts of times at all.
Yeah, it turns out social capital is I think an underrated and not well understood requirement for building community resiliency, particularly among government organizations. But that social capital is key, and that's why we find things like getting businesses back open, getting schools open after a disaster. All these things are lending themselves to reestablishing that social connectiveness. And Waffle House I'm pretty sure they never set out to do this, but that becomes one of the first places that many people can start sharing experience with other people and I think one of the things that's really interesting is they find out, I'm not the only one going through this. I'm not the only one feeling like I am. And I'm not the only one that's looking at what, you know, the day after almost looks hopeless. because everybody here is facing the same challenges. And guess what? We're going to get through this.
Yeah, I think you know, it's there's nothing like a disaster or the aftermath of a disaster to pull people together. And my own personal experience, I've had a few disasters, and I was actually on the last plane allowed to land on the east coast of America on September 11. I was actually going to New York from England, where I was living at the time, I worked at Warner Brothers, funnily enough, and I was going for a film premiere for one night. And found myself in Boston in just such a bizarre situation for 2 weeks. And I think that just changed me. And being, you know, part of a community that's going through such devastation, if you can have that little place that, you know, you feel comfortable in, and it's there for you, like there is nothing like it. And I think it's a massive opportunity for private sector organizations to, you know, identify that that's the role that they can play. And I think here in Australia, you know, we have bushfires, we have droughts, we have floods, you know, we have a lot of similar type disasters as well. And, you know, a lot of our corporates could probably put a bit more time into thinking what role they play for their communities that give them the social license to operate, as opposed to, you know, what role can they just play for their profits. Now, can I ask you, in terms of you've obviously got so much experience from working at FEMA, and you led responses to so many hurricanes and disaster situations, and changing and driving, you know, leadership. What value from your experience in terms of capabilities does the private sector in America offer to government and also to communities in the before, during, and after stages of disasters?
Well, I started out initially in the fire service. I was a paramedic. I became a local county emergency manager. I served the state of Florida as state emergency manager, went to FEMA. And the thing that I learned throughout my career was it's very easy to fall in the trap of doing what I call government-centric planning. And I came out of the fire service where this is really evident, is that we always look to government as the solution to the problems. You dial 911 or your emergency number and help arrives. And those systems are built and reinforced and are used daily. And too often these government organizations will then try to apply that to a disaster. And I don't think we actually do a good job of teaching folks that disasters are not big emergencies. As I like to point out, if the org chart of government is taking care of things, then you don't need emergency management. But when that system starts to break, it doesn't meet the needs, it's increasingly something that government can't solve by itself. We began planning after the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, looking at what a catastrophic hurricane would do to Florida. And we actually had one. We had it back in the 20s, the Great Miami Hurricane, which struck South Florida, crossed the state as a hurricane, and hit Pensacola and the other end of our panhandle as a hurricane. And when we modeled that today, the numbers were staggering. It was about a $100 billion storm. Up to 12,000 folks would be without power for potentially weeks. And as we began our plans for that, we kept running out of things. There wasn't enough government, and including our federal partners, including the Department of Defense, we still ran out of stuff. We just couldn't get to everybody fast enough. And we began asking the question of what's left. And we had done a good job, I think, after Hurricane Andrew in 1992 of incorporating our volunteer organizations into our response, where we worked as one team. But we were leaving the private sector out, and we were leaving the public out. And I found that with the private sector, increasingly they were seeing the need to engage, but there wasn't a good relationship with government. Too often the relationship between government and business is more regulatory, it's rules-based. It's not really a collaborative environment. And so we had to create that space in emergency management. The state of Florida, we built a part of our emergency operations center around the business community. Well, we couldn't have them all in the EOC, but we set up what we call the virtual emergency operations center. So we could do conference calls with all of the major retailers and give them the information that we had, what we were doing, so we could coordinate what they were going to do. A lot of hurdles there on both sides to get through, but we found that by incorporating the private sector, we actually sped up response. In the United States, almost all of our telecommunications is privately owned, from cell companies to your landlines, your internet, Wi-Fi, cable. Most of our power, electrical generation, is in the private sector. Increasingly, we're seeing other utilities move to the private sector, and then almost all the goods and services are in the private sector. So not incorporating them into your plans uh, created this dynamic that we would respond with government to the point where the system failed, and then there was nothing else. And by incorporating the private sector, we raised that threshold that we weren't hitting that point where everything just collapsed at once when we ran out of stuff, but was more resilient to the impacts of these big disasters.
Can I ask you, in the States, obviously we've talked a lot about the Waffle House, which again, I'm such a fan of. So who are the other leading private sector organizations in America who are driving either disaster resilience or preparedness or recovery solutions that support communities?
Well, it turns out it is a lot of our major retailers, which are located in the Southeast United States or have a lot of stores in the Southeast that have been dealing with hurricanes. So everything from Walmart, which runs an emergency operations center at their headquarters, where they do everything from tracking their employees and making sure their employees are safe, to getting stores open, getting supplies moved. They actually have a system that when they know a storm or whether it's a blizzard or a hurricane or wildfires, that there will be certain things their stores will need to stock up on. So rather than running out of stuff, they'll start moving inventory from across the country to areas they know are going to need stuff in the aftermath disaster. Two of our major, what we call big box hardware stores, Lowe's and Home Depot, are also located in the South. And they will go in, and an example, when Joplin, Missouri was struck with a tornado on the Fugate scale, an EF5, basically winds close to 200 miles an hour. This storm is about a mile wide, just devastated the town. And the local Home Depot was flattened. Home Depot brought in literally big circus tents and supplies they knew people would need to start rebuilding and repairing. And we're up and running 2 days after that tornado. They didn't have everything they normally stocked in their store, but they had the things that people needed to start rebuilding and repairing their homes. And so what we've seen is, on the retail side, that's improved. We're also watching in the electrical systems, particularly in the South, where they've had a lot of hurricane experience. They do a lot of what we call mutual aid, of moving crews across these companies across the United States. So when Superstorm Sandy hit, New York and New Jersey and the region up there had not had big power outages due to windstorms in some time, but crews from across the country that had joined up and helped them get their power back up. So we have seen that, but COVID has opened up a whole new area of the private sector. And now we're starting to see more of the tech companies. We're starting to see banking and financial institutions that are really now looking for, how do they participate? How do they leverage what they do best with what government does? And again, every disaster is an opportunity to grow and build our teams as we learn more about the capabilities that private sector can bring in, if we allow them to and we treat them as part of the team.
Yeah, I love that. And we are working on and soon to be activating a model called the Resilient Australia Alliance, which is exactly that. It's about how do we help build understanding and capabilities within the private sector to support government in creating a resilient nation and supporting the recovery and also preparedness. Because I think if we all work together, we know we're stronger than when we work together. Now, I always finish with the same question, and this can be anything at all. So what would be the 2 things you'd like to be done differently in the disaster space?
Put more emphasis on the public as a resource and base our response upon needs, not just geographical dots on a map or representation. We see this play out in the United States too often, that low-income, poor communities suffer the most during disasters and often get the least resources. We're seeing this play out with COVID. And I'd really think that we should be responding to the needs of people, not stuff, and that we ought to be people-centric in our approach to responding to disasters.
I love it. That's, yeah, I mean, to me, people are the epicenter and people are the foundation, and it's the people we need to think about first. And just to reflect on what you said earlier in our conversation, I think the social capital element of it and the people investment is the forgotten, because it's, you know, it's not a bridge. We can't build it and see it, but I think it's the forgotten part that is almost the most important part when we're looking at building resilience and then leading and activating recovery. Craig, thank you so much for joining me. I have been following you for a number of years and I have been hoping to tap into you and have a conversation with you. I reckon we might have many more in the future, but I really appreciate your time. So today I've been talking to Craig Fugate, the Chief Emergency Management Officer who works at One Concern and also is a former FEMA Administrator from 2009 to 2017. And we have been talking about the Waffle House Index, amongst many other things. Craig, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
That's the end of this episode of Doing Disasters Differently, the podcast, which I hope you found to be relevant, informative, and inspiring. If you're interested in participating in the conversation or to connect with me personally, please visit corporate2community.com. Until the next episode, stay safe and remember we all have a role to play in thinking differently and doing differently before, during, and after disasters.